A savory heritage. The history of Louisiana, sausages and mustard. Not everybody has had the chance to taste that exact combination in that exact stillness. And so I do think that explaining why it matters is important. Because that simple pairing is more than a good breakfast. It is an edible timeline, a direct line back to the communal boucheries of the 18th century, and the layered history of every hand that ever stirred a gumbo pot. To understand why that knife cuts so cleanly, and why the mustard bites so hard, we have to go back to the beginning, the foundation, a history of smoke and spice. What we now call Louisiana sausage is not a recipe that arrived in a trunk and simply survived. It is a record of forced migration and hard necessity, of people who had to rethink everything they knew about meat when they found themselves in a setting that refused to cooperate. The Acadians, expelled from Nova Scotia during the great upheaval of the mid-18th century, brought with them the French habit of nose-to-tail butchery. Nothing wasted, nothing left for the flies. They arrived in the bayous carrying that knowledge, but the bayous were not Nova Scotia. The humidity here does not simply inconvenience. It actively conspires against preservation. European drying sheds meant nothing in air thick enough to drink. And so the smoking intensified, the curing deepened, and the spices grew bolder. They did so not out of culinary ambition, but because they had to. A quieter migration had already been shaping the butchery culture before the Acadians ever arrived. German immigrants settled in Louisiana as early as 1725, bringing with them a formal understanding of charcuterie that elevated what had been rural survival into something more deliberate. They are the ones credited with establishing the boucherie in South Louisiana. They built a communal event rather than just a slaughter. Whole families gathered. Music played. Sausage got made by many hands where it might otherwise have been made by two. It is easy to romanticize the boucherie now, and I am sure most of us do. But it was practical before it was picturesque, a seasonal rhythm of shared labor that turned a single hog into enough sausage to carry a family through months when nothing else was plentiful. And of course, with sausage came the question of what to put alongside it. Something to cut the fat, to stand up to the smoke. The mustard connection. Beyond the bottle. I did not grow up with Creole mustard, and I have spent enough years trying to make up for that to know exactly what I was missing. The first time I saw a jar of it, genuinely saw it, on a butcher block counter in a shotgun kitchen in the Treme, next to a split length of andouille still glistening from the pan. I understood that this was not a condiment in the way I had been taught to think of condiments. It was not an afterthought. It was not a squirt of yellow brightness meant to disguise the meat beneath it. It was the counterweight. Creole mustard emerged in New Orleans sometime in the mid-1800s, a product of German immigrant mustard-making traditions meeting a city that already knew how to cook with more fat, more smoke, and more intensity than almost anywhere else in the country. The graininess matters. What sets it apart from standard American mustard is the combination of brown mustard seeds macerated in vinegar with the aggressive, root-deep heat of horseradish. It is not smooth. It bites back. A fatty smoked andouille, or a dense, liver-rich link of boudin, needs a sharp acidic foil, and the smooth, vinegary mustards that were common elsewhere simply collapsed against that richness. They disappeared. Creole mustard does not disappear. It cuts through the fat with texture and heat in equal measure, working as a palate reset that lets each bite of sausage hit as clearly as the first. The precise origin is murky in the way that so much Louisiana food history is murky, attributed by some accounts to a German peddler, by others to small commercial operations whose antique bottles are now collector's items. I find that appropriate, honestly. A condiment this essential to the region's cooking belongs to the community that made it necessary, not to any single name. The pantry did not demand it because someone marketed it well. The pantry demanded it because the sausage demanded it, and the sausage had been demanding it for generations. Where that demand took different shapes, whether it called for the grain-forward bite of the Creole table or the deep, aggressive smoke of the Cajun smokehouse, is where the story splits. Regional landscapes, Cajun versus Creole, profiles. The split between Cajun and Creole sausage traditions is not merely a matter of taste. It is a record of how two different Louisianas learned to survive and then to eat. In the Acadiana prairie and the bayou country, the kitchen was an extension of the boucherie. Smoke was the primary preservative, and rice was the great stretcher. The shift from blood-based boudin to the pork and rice link we know today was not a culinary whim. It was an economic necessity, documented clearly enough in a 1939 list of rice dishes of Louisiana that included boudin right alongside jambalaya. This is a cuisine built by families who needed every pound of pork to feed a dozen people, and the smokehouse was as essential as the stove. New Orleans, by contrast, was a port city with a different kind of abundance and an entirely different rhythm. Creole sausages and the dishes they anchored, such as jambalaya with tomatoes and deeply spiced gumbos, reflected a table set by French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean hands. The spice rack was wider. The heat was higher. The sauces were more complex because the city's markets could supply what the isolated prairie could not. The difference captures something essential. In Cajun country, the sausage is the meal, stretched and smoked to stand on its own. In the Creole kitchen, it is often one voice in a densely layered chorus. That is why, even now, a Cajun jambalaya likely skips the tomato, while a Creole one almost certainly does not. Yet both traditions rely on a clandestine ingredient to bridge these diverse flavors together. The unexpected ingredient, the cane syrup secret. The ingredient that pulls it all together is one we rarely think about, even though it has been growing underfoot since the early 1800s. I am talking about cane syrup, a small amount added to the curing mix. It does not announce itself the way pepper does. What it does is far more subtle and far more important. Sugar is the great reconciler. Those few spoonfuls of dark, viscous syrup deepen the smoke, temper the salt, and crucially, fuel the browning that builds the deep, savory crust on a properly cooked link. The Maillard reaction asks for a little sugar, and cane syrup delivers it with an earthy sweetness that refined sugar simply cannot match. And that same quiet sweetness works against the mustard, too. The sharp, grain-forward bite of a good Creole mustard can feel almost combative against a fatty, heavily smoked sausage. Cane syrup threads a line between them, softening the acid without ever making itself the star. It is the ingredient that lets the sausage and the mustard live together on the plate instead of fighting for control of it. That is no small thing in a kitchen where balance has always been the whole point. I am sure I am not alone in finding that once you know the story behind a thing, the supermarket version never quite satisfies again. The vacuum-sealed, uniformly pink sausages lined up under fluorescent lights have their place, I suppose. But they cannot carry the weight of what we have been speaking about. Not really. So I would encourage you to do something small, but meaningful. Seek out the family-run meat markets where the smokehouse still runs on oak and pecan, and the recipe for the curing mix is older than the building itself. Find the independent grocers who stock Creole mustard made in small batches, the kind with visible seeds and a bite that lingers. When you bring those ingredients into your own kitchen, when you let that sausage sizzle in a hot pan and smell the cane syrup beginning to brown, you are doing more than cooking a meal. You are picking up a thread that has run through Louisiana kitchens for generations. You are keeping a history alive, one link and one spoonful at a time. That, I think, is a kind of stewardship worth the extra stop on the way home.